My favorite tea. So I'm sorry that I get out of sync every once in a while, and that's probably going to keep happening. And I misunderstood. This chapter's only a few more pages. I probably could have finished it yesterday, but I didn't because I thought it was much longer than it is. I mean, it was already pretty long. Well, maybe I was right. No. So that was 17. This is 17 that I'm going to finish. And I'm going to just drop back into the paragraph I had read right when I ended. So when are you going to India? I can't go to India. I don't have money. I have to work at the diner. Well, I'm thinking of giving out some scholarships. Maybe I should give one to you. What? Leonard just smiled and walked away. He was off to another town. I don't feel sensation on the scar on my foot the same way I do on the rest of my skin. It's similar to the way it feels when you press your finger or toenail. I feel pressure but not direct sensation. One day I wore a pair of new sandals and they rubbed a blister into the scar. I didn't notice. I didn't notice when the blister became infected. I didn't notice when the infection traveled up my leg until I started having pain in the glands at the top of my legs. I went to a doctor, and when the nurse saw my scar, she became extremely agitated. I had candy cane red stripes from my ankle to my thigh, and I hadn't noticed. The doctor put me in the hospital immediately. I received penicillin intravenously, which burned as it went into my arm. I drifted off to sleep and had a dream about Baba. He was smiling at me the way Leonard did, eyes sparkling. In the dream, he said, take healing from wherever you get it. When I woke up, the penicillin no longer burned. I was in the hospital for 3 days. When I got out, I saw Danny. I asked him why he hadn't visited me in the hospital. He said he didn't want to support the negative way I used my body to get attention. At first, I was hurt, but after some thought, I realized he was right. I just didn't pay attention to my body, and no one else did either, unless there was something wrong. I had gotten pregnant and ignored it till it was almost too late. I hadn't taken care of myself after the abortion and became infected. I had chronic bronchitis, but I still smoked. I almost lost my leg because I didn't clean a small blister. I had to be on the verge of death so that I could receive care, not consciously, but repetitively. I used my body to ask for help. While I had been in the hospital, the other people who worked at DOTS had managed without me. They made small changes in how things were done. I felt supplanted and replaceable. In a petulant emotional reaction, I quit. I wanted to go to India. I wanted to be a rebirther. I wanted to be with Leonard and Babaji. I wrote to Leonard asking if he really would pay my way to India, and he wrote back inviting me to Campbell Hot Springs, a rebirthing training center that he owned in the Sierra Mountains near where I had lived before. Now I wore long calico skirts, Birkenstocks, and my own necklace. I quit smoking, smiled and hugged, and talked about Baba and breathing. My transformation into a New Age seeker was complete. I hitched a ride to Campbell Hot Springs, and when I arrived, I discovered that, although Leonard owned the property, there was a group of people living there collectively. They felt some sense of ownership as well. They were wonderful people, but they made it clear that no matter what Leonard had said, I needed to pay to be there, and I didn't have any money. But I knew how to cook. That first day I went into the kitchen, looked around, and figured out how to make dinner with what was there. We had carrot soup and biscuits. Everyone gave me a little bit of money for the meal, and I used it to buy more ingredients. Within a month, I was serving 2 meals a day and snacks. My little cottage industry afforded me a cabin on the property. I began each day baking bread. I formed the loaves, set them to rise, walked up a path to the hot springs, soaked, and walked back to the kitchen. By the time everyone woke up, the smell of bread filled the air. I did many rebirthing sessions and attended trainings. I was happy in a way that I had never experienced. I was happy in my body. At Campbell's, people were naked all the time, naked in hot tubs, naked in the pool. From the first day I arrived, I knew that if I didn't take my clothes off, I would seem uptight. I was scared, but I just decided to push myself. Excuse me. I just decided to push myself. I started with taking off my shirt. Soon I was slipping out of my skirt. I just began to relax. I felt completely, unconditionally loved and accepted. I never felt judged for being fat. People did tell me that I could lose weight with affirmations, but no one seemed to think it was really important. I believed that if I continued to expand the feelings of self-acceptance and relaxation, that I would lose weight naturally. I just thought it would happen. I was in no hurry for anything except India and Babaji. One day I got out of the hot tub to pee. I walked into the woods a few feet from the tubs and squatted. I looked through deep green pine trees out over the blue-brown valley. The sun was beginning to pour through the trees, divided into shafts of light by their branches. I saw the cows grazing and heard the sounds of birds all around me. I took a deep breath and pulled in all the pine-pure mountain air. I felt like a completely natural woman, comfortable enough to pee naked in the woods. Bill Chappelle was a seminar leader known for his humor and wisdom. I had read the preface he wrote for the book Rebirthing in the New Age, and I had fallen in love immediately just from the words. He was funny, reverent, and smart. Once a month I went into San Francisco where Leonard had a house that he called Theta House to attend a one-year seminar. One day I was sitting on the steps at Theta House talking to a friend. Bill arrived to do a weekend seminar. He had long sandy hair, opaque blue eyes, and was just so cute. As he came up the steps, he smiled at us and said hi. My heart began to race. He leaned over, picked up my friend, and carried her into Theta House, flirting all the way. At another time in my life, I might have sunk into self-recrimination and depression, but he wasn't going to be able to pick me up and carry me off anywhere. But I was so interested in my sense of magical connections that began with Autobiography of a Yogi, I just laughed. Later, he approached me and began to make jokes. I felt like he was making sure I wasn't angry because he carried off my friend. I just smiled and said, "Did you have a good time?" I had made a place for myself in the world of rebirthers, but I wasn't making enough money to get to India. One day, Leonard showed up at Campbell's to give a rebirthing training. I greeted him with a plate of chocolate chip cookies. He was happy that I was running the kitchen. He talked about his suggestion of an India scholarship. He said he would pay my way, but he thought I could get the money myself. I took it as a spiritual challenge. So this is 18, and the epigraph is, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd." Flannery O'Connor. We sat cross-legged on a plush beige carpet. Candles were flickering, and the smoky scent of incense filled the room. A macrame hanging dominated one wall. There was a fire in the fireplace, and pottery jars filled with flowers sat on two mahogany tables. A wind chime made of sand dollars and bells tinkled by an open window. Leonard sat on a powder blue couch, sucking one corner of his thin black mustache into his mouth while he pulled long drafts of air into his nose. When Leonard took a deep breath, we all took a deep breath. That night, he wore a yellow T-shirt with the word "breathe" emblazoned across the front, and beneath it, "breathe," was a design of an androgynous torso rising from a coiled shell. "The world," Leonard said, "is coming to an end, and we are seeking the immortal kingdom of God." Heads nodded. The syncopated sound of inhales rippled through the room. Once we experience a breath release and we are freed from the death-birth cycle, we can rise to the vibration of our bodies. This is what Baba has done. At the mention of Baba's name, another ripple of inhales moved across smiling faces. We were all in a swoon. It barely mattered that Leonard's reasoning seemed oblique. If you've done a rebirthing session, you understand what he meant by a breath release. If you hadn't, the rhythmic group breathing became intoxicating. Anything seemed possible. Leonard went on to tell us that just being in Baba's presence would accelerate our spiritual growth. When the world began to fall apart, we would need to be clear. "Don't worry," Leonard said. "Baba loves you. When you're afraid, just say, 'Bole Baba Ki Jai.' It means victory to the loving Father. Just say it to fill you with Baba's love." Our host that evening was Fran Hubert. Recently separated from her husband, she had just finished getting her PhD in alternative psychology. She was working to define herself beyond the role of wife and mother. For Fran, going to India was just one more step out of the cul-de-sac. She looked over at me and smiled. Later in the kitchen, she asked me if I was going to India soon. She said we could travel together. That night, I wrote another letter to Baba. I told him that it seemed like the reason I wasn't able to go to India was because I didn't have the money. I didn't want to believe that money would stop me from being with him. Why didn't he just tell me what I needed to know about what was stopping me so the energy would move? I sent off for the Boulder post office to mail the letter, and I decided to get a job. Maybe two. The first job I thought I would get would be cooking. Of course, I wasn't sure I wanted to work at Nancy's restaurants. As I walked down the Boulder Mall, I looked into the windows of different restaurants. One place was popular with the college crowd. I didn't think they'd hire an Ohm-sign Birkenstock-wearing New Ager. Another place was popular with the bikers because of their big greasy burgers and baskets of fries. I was a little bit scared to work there. I looked at Fred's. Fred's was somewhere between a dinner house and a dinner house and a diner. Nothing too fancy, cheap, good food, and Fred played guitar while you ate. All sorts of folks ate there. I wondered if he'd hire me to cook. As I walked past Fred's, I heard a voice call, "Tish." I looked up and saw a young woman running toward me. She was dressed in tight jeans and a halter top. She was running in spiked heels. I worried that she was about to fall over. "Did you get the money?" she asked breathlessly. I really didn't recognize her. I looked down at the letter to Baba, looked back up at her, and asked, "What money?" "Remember me? I lived with Joey out back in the van." Slowly it came to me. She had lived in a van behind the house on 9th and Arapahoe, in which I afforded the nice apartment because I worked in the factory, the apartment where I had first read Autobiography of a Yogi. I had moved out because the house had been torn down to build a senior citizen center. It was a HUD-funded project, and when HUD makes you move, they pay for your moving expenses and your rent for 3 weeks, or 3 months rather. At the time we all moved, no one knew that. Now people were receiving checks. I don't remember her name. If she ran up to me now, I would not recognize her. But as she told me the details of the HUD checks, I felt as if the letter in my hand was tingling. I didn't feel like I needed to mail it. Instead of the post office, I went to the HUD office, and there was a check for me for $2,500. It was enough money to get to India. The money had been there all the while. I just didn't know it. The money didn't come out of the air. The miracle was that I was open to finding out about it and getting it. And now I was going to go to India. 2 weeks later, my cheek was pressed against the window of an Air India 747. I had $35 in my pocket. The miracle money had dwindled. I peered through the layers of clouds and watched as we flew over rows of mustard-colored mountaintops. The filtered air coming from the nozzle above my head blew strands of my hair into my eyes. I leaned back. Fran was still asleep, sprawled across 3 seats to my left. Eddie Norman was behind us, reading. Eddie's wife had been involved with rebirthing for some time, but that evening at Fran's had been his first exposure, and now in a short time he was on a plane with 2 women he barely knew, going to India. The stewardess leaned in and smiled and said, "Would you like some coffee?" "Sure," I said, wondering what time it was. I felt as if I'd been on the plane for days. It had been a 3-hour flight from Colorado to New York and 14 hours since we left there. Fran sat up, ran her hands through her hair, rubbing her scalp and then her eyes. The stewardess offered her some coffee, and she nodded a groggy consent. She smiled at me, watery-eyed, and blinked in her effort to see. We filled 2 days of travel with stories. Fran and her permanent psychologist mommy, Aunt Manor, had wielded most of our autobiographies from both Eddie and me. She moved between us, gathering details and doling out analysis, Kleenex and hand cream. It had grown dark outside the window. The moon was full and shimmering over the wing of the plane. The pilot announced our impending arrival in New Delhi. We began to gather up the sprawl of our long sojourn. Books went back to the sleeves of carry-on luggage. Magazines went back into the racks over the bulkhead. Shoes and sweaters were pulled off and tables back into their upright positions. Eddie moved up to sit in the row with Fran and me, and I smiled at him. Bole Baba Ki Jai. Bole Baba Ki Jai, they echoed back to me. I bet you this is the really long chapter. Oh, no. Bole Baba Ki Jai. My stomach lurched as the descent began. By the time the wheels hit the tarmac, I was trembling with anticipation. We were exiting through a door in the rear of the plane. The aisles were full of people trying to wait patiently. Whole families of Indians clustered together. Men in turbans and business suits glanced at watches. Two tall blonde men standing in the row in front of me began to speak to each other in German. I noticed a pale white woman still seated in the middle row with long brown hair and saffron-colored sweater, holding her wristwatch between her slender fingers. Her eyes were closed. She seemed to be meditating. I wondered which guru she was coming to visit. I bent my head under the door, and as I stepped into the top step of the metal stairs, I was blasted with the thickest, wettest, hottest air I had ever felt. The smell was a combination of sweat, wood smoke, and putrefying fruit. I clutched the metal railing and made my way down the wobbly steps. The man at the customs table seemed worried when I said I only have $35. Fran leaned back and said, "She's with me." He looked at me through thick glasses. His khaki skirt was ringed with sweat, and his jet black hair was plastered to his head. One side of his mouth went up, and his head bobbed. "Okay, madam, go on with your friends, but don't lose them," he admonished. We walked out to the crowd of people in front of the airport and were swarmed with bodies. Hands in front of our faces beseeching, voices saying, "Please, madam. Madam, do you need a taxi? Please, madam, just a little money. Madam, do you need a hotel?" All mixed with Hindi that I didn't understand. I just looked into brown eyes and smiled, shook my head helplessly. I was disoriented and tired and hot, but I was happy to be there. "Bole Baba Ki Jai," I said, smiling. The expression did not change. The small hands moved closer in front of my face. "Please, madam." I looked at this boy. He may have been 7 or 8. His eyebrows were knit. His lips were peeled back and cracked. The shirt and shoes he wore were hanging on his body, bones jutting above the collar from the sleeves. He struggled to keep his footing amongst the jostling bodies gathering around me. "Tish." I looked up and saw Fran waving at me. I pushed through the crowd, away from the outreached hands. Eddie was in deep negotiation. Even hunched over, his 6-foot beefy frame towered over the wiry, short man. His eyes, wide and guileless as always, were focused on the man's hands, which were animating his rapid delivery of information. "Come, mister. My brother has a hotel. It's not far. We can walk." The man began to walk, holding a loose strap from Eddie's backpack. "But what's the cost? Are there other hotels? How far is it?" Eddie's attempts at being a savvy traveler dribbled out of his mouth as he surrendered to the more directed will of our new tour guide. Fran looked at me quizzically and then shrugged. "Bole Baba Ki Jai," she said, and rushed to catch up with Eddie. I looked over my shoulder. The crowd of begging children had moved on. The boy was gone. We were shown to a hotel and then to a small room with one large bed. We noticed a small salamander-looking thing, and we asked the man about it. He giggled and told us it was poisonous and we should be careful. And then he left. We all lay across the bed and jumped at every sound. The young man who had directed us to the hotel was waiting for us in front of it the next morning. He took us on a tour. We went to Gandhi's tomb, sat on a hill, and smoked some hash that he provided for us. The streets of Delhi were filled with cars, not necessarily driving in a straight line. There were families of 5 and 6 all perched on one bicycle. There were elephants. We were in India, and we would soon be with Baba, and we were in bliss. Our new friend, the source of all supply, found us another hotel for the evening, one in which there were no salamanders, or so he said. Pictures of Shiva, Ram, and Ganesh were on cabs and buses. Statues, little altars, representations of God were everywhere. It was a whole day by taxi or bus to the town of Haldwani, where we would meet up with some devotees. We decided to take a cab instead of a bus. Our friend found us someone who was willing to make the trip. We drove through the Indian countryside. It was extremely hot, and we were so thirsty. Every time we stopped for a break, we drank soda, Campa Cola, and Limca. The sugar from the soda only increased our thirst, but we were afraid to drink the water. The radio in the cab supplied a steady stream of Indian pop music. Suddenly, in the middle of one song, there was a voice singing in English. "That's the way, I like it, The cab driver looked to see our reaction. We all burst into laughter. In Haldwani, we met Mr. Natali, a devotee. He showed us to the room where we could spend the night. There were mats on the floor. We were still tired from all the traveling, so we slept well. The next morning, Mr. Natali came to the room to wake us up, saying, "Today you're going to see Baba. Bole Baba Ki Jai."